All right, this is going to be a different setup because when I tried to record this live during the lesson, my laptop was full and couldn't record the audio. So I'm just doing this on my own. That's why you don't hear anyone else in the background. So as we were going through our apologetic series, we've now um, covered the four basic laws of reality, and these are important for having a worldview, right? They're foundational to a worldview. But they aren't enough on their own to explain um, why things are the way they are, right? Why reality is here. And so here's a decent way of explaining it. So we start with ourselves, right? This is you, okay? We have to start with ourselves because there's just no other place to start. We observe things through our own senses, from our own perspective, right? We have to start with us. And we are born into the world, right? Just pretend that this green box is the created world, right? The physical universe. And as we grow up, as we get older, we begin to notice things in the world. We begin to notice it's consistent, that it's got patterns, that things are ordered, and that we have just assumed this for our whole life, right? At some point, we kind of realize this, and this is where the four laws of reality fall in. Okay, they describe reality as it is, but they don't explain why reality is the way that it is, right? They simply describe it. Okay, and so then it's natural for us to wonder, well, okay, I understand that the world around me exists and that exists in the way that it does, but why is that the case, right? What brought this here? And so as we start to wonder this leads us to, well, what's outside of this reality, right? What's the reason for reality? In other words, we're looking for we need a sufficient reason for reality. Okay, now what is a sufficient reason? Well, a sufficient reason is a reason that is the only plausible explanation for something, right? So a good example, um, a sufficient reason for a human being existing is that they have human parents. Okay, that is a sufficient reason because that is the only way human beings come into existence, unless you're Adam, Eve, or the Lord Jesus Christ. Um, so human parents are a sufficient reason, right? We don't need to look beyond that. That completely suffices all that's necessary for a human being to exist. Okay? But so that's fine when we're talking about stuff in the created order. But when we're talking about um, things of the magnitude that we're talking about when we talk about apologetics, we're asking for something way bigger, right? So we need a reason that completely explains reality. Now, when I say it completely explains reality, I'm not saying it gives us all the answers for everything in the world, shows us absolutely every square inch of the universe. No. I'm just saying it explains the framework of reality, right? It explains the box. It explains why the box is here, why the box works the way that it does. Okay? There are still things in the box that we need to discover, but whatever we discover inside the box is going to fall under the laws of the box, which is the four laws of reality. Okay? And so, one way that we do this, one way that we find the reason that completely explains reality, is process of elimination. And so we're going to lay out the possibilities of uh, reasons for reality, and we're going to go through them and see, well, which one of these don't make sense. Sorry, which one of these doesn't make sense, and um, and then find the one that does make sense through that list. So that leads us to our four possibilities. Our four possibilities for why reality exists. So first off, we have the possibility that reality is an illusion, right? That nothing we are perceiving is truly real, that we are being deluded by something, or perhaps we are in a simulation, and that so nothing we are experiencing is actually real. Okay, that's the first option. Reality is an illusion. Second option is that reality is self created, that there was a time when nothing existed, and then all of a sudden the universe came into existence by its own power and perhaps even by a bit of luck, right? It just came into existence. Option three is that reality is self existent. There's a difference between self created and self existent. Self created still means that the thing was created, which means there was a time when it didn't exist. Self existent just means that you have the power of existence in yourself, right? So the reality, the universe has always been here and will always be here in some form or another. And the last option, the fourth option, is that reality was created by a self-existent being, right? So there's something that exists apart from the physical universe that created the physical universe, and that in and of itself is self-existent. So these are our four possibilities. Now, this is where we're going to start formally arguing for the existence of God. And as you can see, that's what option four is. But we're going to do that by going through the other three and showing why they don't suffice, right? Why they are not sufficient reasons for why reality is the way that it is. In this lesson, we're really just going to focus on the first two, and in the next lesson, we will focus on the latter two. All right, so let's start with reality is an illusion. All right, reality as an illusion. This is something you've probably heard of before. Um, in modern parlance, you'll often hear of reality as a simulation, or if you've ever seen the film The Matrix, right, where people are plugged into a computer system that gives them a perception of the world existing in, late 90s America, but in reality they are being used as human batteries by machines, right? So something is being imposed upon them. And so what this view posits at the core of it is that nothing we experience is truly real, right? Everything we are perceiving with our senses is false. It's fake, right? We are being deluded. We are having an illusion put upon us, right? And that's even assuming that we can trust our senses, okay? But perhaps even our senses are not real. Perhaps we are being deluded into thinking that we have these five senses, okay? So that's the core. Nothing we experience is real, okay? We are being deceived by something else. Like I said, today, you'll often hear this referred to as simulation theory, right? We are, under some kind of computer simulation, right? But this idea existed before computers, right? You had people positing that perhaps we're being under, or we're under the delusion of a sorcerer or a demon, something that's giving us an illusion, right? And an illusion is just a false view of reality, right? You believe something is real when it actually isn't. Your mind is being tricked into thinking that something is true when it is not. Okay? But some will even take this further than just you're under an illusion, you're under the deception of something else. And they'll say, we may not even really exist at all, right? Everything may be fake. There may not be any such thing as real or existence, right? Everything may be illusory. And this really is kind of a radical skepticism view, right? Very skeptical, questioning quite literally everything that you could possibly know. And this skepticism comes out of the Enlightenment. Now, none of the Enlightenment thinkers were really going down this far of a rabbit trail, but it finds its origins in the Enlightenment. And if you watch the Church History series, you'll see that the Enlightenment was in many ways a response to the cultural disillusionment that was brought about due to the Protestant Reformation. Because before the Reformation, at least in Western Europe, this is where the Enlightenment got started, in Western Europe, the Church of Rome was sort of the standard bearer of truth, right? If there was a disagreement on especially big things like faith or morals or even philosophy, you would go to the Church of Rome and there would be some decision they had likely made, right? And people knew the church had its problems, but it still had the strongest claim to infallible institutional authority. But with the Reformation, now much of Europe saw that the Church of Rome had not just erred on kind of minor issues or just had some individuals that had failed or some leadership problems, but it had erred on major theological issues. And so many said, okay, well, I can't trust the Catholic Church, but also this Protestant movement can't unite, right? You had the Lutherans, you had the Reformed, then you have King Henry VIII with the Anglicans, and you got these Anabaptists running around doing stuff, right? There's no unity here. And even though they'll all say, well, you can look to Scripture, a lot of people at this time couldn't read, right? Or if they could, there's different interpretations of Scripture going around. So there is this widespread um, disillusionment. And people are beginning to ask themselves, what can I really trust? And on top of this, you have all the wars that are happening as a result of the Reformation, which are making people's lives even more chaotic. And so the world around them is chaotic, and their mind is also chaotic. And they're asking, what can we know for certain? Right? Our worldview has been torn down. What can we know? Well, this gives rise to a philosopher named Rene Descartes. Again, if you watch the Church History series, I believe it's Reason and Revival, where I talk about this. And Rene Descartes sought to answer this skepticism, not by ignoring it, but by diving headfirst into it. And he said, okay, if I question everything, is there anything I can know for certain? Right? If I question everything I perceive with my senses, everything I think I know from past knowledge or experience, what can I know for certain? If I doubt everything, what can really be known? Well, what he said, what he discovered, is that even if I doubt everything, I am still the one doubting. Okay? And that means I exist. I cannot doubt if I do not exist. And this gives rise to the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Or in the Latin, it's cogito ergo sum. Right? It's the most famous line that Descartes is known for. I think, therefore I am. If I am doubting, which is an act of thinking, right, then I must exist. So if I think, that must mean that I exist. Okay? Or in other words, if we doubt everything, we must still exist in order to doubt. Okay? So even if we doubt what we see, if we doubt what we've already known, if we doubt what we've learned, we're still doubting. Right? Even if everything we perceive is an illusion, even if our bodies are an illusion, and we're actually just brains in a box somewhere being plugged in, right? That's still something of us that is real, that exists, right? If it exists, then it is real, okay? So if we exist, then we had to have come from somewhere real, okay? Like I said, even if we are just reduced to brains in a box, that's still something real, right? And if it's a reality, then that's a reality that needs to be explained, right? And likewise, if we're going with the common version of this view, that something is causing us to fall under an illusion, if we're being deceived, then where did the deceiver come from? Right? If we're in a computer simulation, what reality is this computer living in? Right? If we're under the spell of a demon or a sorcerer, what reality is that demon or sorcerer in? Okay? And so the problem with this view, in terms of trying to explain reality, is that it doesn't. It really just pushes it back another layer, right? Going back to the boxes that I had earlier, it really just adds another layer, right? Instead of you existing in reality, it's you exist, or at least your perception of reality is this illusion, and then outside of that, you still exist in the real world in some form, and then that real world needs to be explained. So we just pushed it back another layer. We haven't actually answered the question yet. But, like I said earlier, some will go further with this, and they'll accuse Descartes of assuming things, right? They'll say, well, Descartes actually assumes things when he makes the statement of, I think, therefore I am. And that is true. Descartes is assuming that logic works. And primarily, he's assuming the law of non-contradiction, which we've gone over before, right? Because he cannot both exist and not exist at the same time, in the same sense. And he's also assuming causality, because he's saying thinking is an effect that must be caused by a thinker, right? Doubting is an effect that must be caused by a doubter, okay? So he is assuming things, or he did assume things, I should say, but he's assuming what we've already gone over, that everyone assumes in order to live in this world, right? No one truly lives believing the law of non-contradiction does not exist, or the law of causality does not exist, right? No one acts in the world in that way. But still, some will say, what if there really is no real? What if the illusion is all there is, right? At that point, it's not really an illusion, it's just a hallucination at that point. But if there's no real, then what would we actually call fake, though? Right? What's the point of saying everything is fake if there is no real to compare it to? Okay, so that's already one problem with this view, is that If you're saying the illusion, we're just all experiencing this collective illusion, and in fact, nothing is real outside of it, well, we might as well call the illusion real at that point. And so, if you're going to reject Descartes' assumptions of non-contradiction, causality, and really just logic and reason altogether, your only um, your only view you can run to at that point is absurdism, right? It's absurdism. It's saying that life is just absurd. It makes no sense at all, and nothing matters. Okay. But embracing this view means you reject reason. Okay. And as a Christian, if someone comes to you and says, "I reject reason because I reject God," okay, I cannot believe in reason because reason follows naturally from God. If someone is saying that, let them make a fool of themselves. Give them the megaphone, right? Let them tell the world how their worldview is superior because they reject reason and logic, right? Most people, even if they're not believers, will recognize that makes no sense, and it doesn't make any sense, right? If abandoning God requires you to abandon reason, then it shows that you are not on the right path, that your worldview is not, it doesn't make any sense, right? And so let people like that who are very obstinate in their view that no, reason doesn't exist, logic doesn't exist, let them make a fool of themselves and let others see, well, if reason seems to be on the side of Christians, or at the very least on the side of theists, then maybe I should look into that beyond just ignoring it outright. So that's the illusion possibility. Now we come to the possibility that reality is self-created. This one's a bit more common, but it's just as easy to refute. So another term for self-creation, because you don't often hear that term, but another term for it would be spontaneous generation. That something is coming out of nothing. Okay, there are older forms of spontaneous generation. More modern terms have nuanced it a bit, but this is essentially what it is, right? That something just forms out of nothing. Okay. Now it should go without saying that there are no known examples of self-creation. No known examples, and most scientists will admit this, but they'll want to take one exception, and that one exception is the creation of everything. I think it was Joe Rogan who pointed out one time, and he's not the only person, but he's the one I'm thinking of right now that pointed out that many of these atheistic scientists reject miracles, but they have space for one miracle, and that miracle is the creation of everything. Right? So to them, it's reasonable to accept the miracle that everything came from nothing, but not reasonable to accept the miracle that someone rose from the dead or water turned into wine. Right? Doesn't make any sense. So they'll either say self-creation only existed in this one case, or what they'll say is that, well, self-creation may exist in a part of the universe that we just don't know about yet. And that's not great to base your belief about the origin of the universe off of something that's either unproven or you're inconsistent in holding to, right? Not great. But we don't even have to allow for the premise that it may exist in another part of the universe we just haven't discovered yet. And that's because self-creation in and of itself is a contradiction. Okay? Because in order to create, one must exist first. In order to do anything, one must exist. Right? If I'm going to do something, at bare minimum, I must exist. If I do not exist, I can't do it. And so if I'm going to create, which is something I can do, right, I must exist. However, if I have not been created yet, then I cannot create myself. Okay? So self-creation is a logical impossibility. One cannot create oneself because oneself does not exist yet. Okay? Self-creation requires one to exist before existing. All right? It requires everything to be brought into existence by its own power, which is not possible. Now, proponents of this theory will run to chance to try to explain this. We'll say, well, chance is the reason for self-creation, because if we give anything enough time, it will eventually produce any possible option, right? So if we give nothing enough time, it'll eventually produce something. You'll often hear this described as, if we give a monkey a typewriter and, billions or trillions of years, eventually it could produce the whole works of Shakespeare. Okay, here's the problem with that. Chance is a measurement of probability based on circumstances. Okay? That's all it is. It's not this magic force. It is not providence for atheists. It is a measurement of probability of something happening. Okay? If I have a coin and I'm going to flip the coin, the probability that it lands on heads is roughly 50-50. Okay? Why is that? Well, it's because of the nature of the coin itself and the act of flipping, right? The circumstances of coin flipping determine what the chances are. Okay? Likewise, if I had a wheel that had 8 different sections on it and I spin it and wait for the arrow to land on one of the sections, well, that's 1 out of 8 chances, right? The probability is 1 out of 8. Okay? But it's measured based on circumstances, right? Now, going back to the flipping of the coin, imagine if there was no coin that existed. What are the chances that it lands on heads now? 0%. Why is that? Because the circumstances for coin flipping are non-existent. Okay? If the circumstances do not exist, there is no chance. So you cannot say, well, if we just give nothing enough time, which at that point it's like, well, what does time even mean if nothing exists? But if we just give nothing enough time, eventually it'll produce something. No, it won't, because the circumstances to produce something are not there. Right? So you see, self-creation is not only a logical impossibility, but we also can't run to chance to explain it, because chance has no power in and of itself. It is not a thing that exists in the world. It is simply a measurement of probability. All right? Now, what some will say is that, well, we're not saying all of reality is self-created, but just that whatever substances there were that caused the Big Bang, those substances, if we gave them enough time, they could have created the world. All right, fine. But at that point, we're saying something exists in reality that isn't self-created, but in fact is self-existent. And so that would lead us into possibility 3, but we will get to that next week. For now, I will leave you with this, and that is that if anything exists, something must self-exist. Okay? We'll get into this more next time. But if anything exists, it must either be created by something or must have the power of existence in itself.